Every year, approximately 30 people vanish without a trace in the Australian outback. Their cars are found abandoned on remote highways, engines still running, doors wide open, personal belongings untouched. No bodies, no footprints leading away into the desert, no signs of struggle, just empty vehicles sitting in the middle of nowhere, as if their occupants simply evaporated into the scorching air. The official explanations range from dehydration and disorientation to animal attacks, but those explanations don't account for one disturbing detail. Many of these disappearances happen at night, when the desert cold would make wandering away from a vehicle not just unlikely, but suicidal. The truckers who regularly traverse these lonely roads have a different explanation, one they share only with each other in hushed conversations at isolated rest stops. They'll tell you that certain stretches of highway aren't safe after dark, that there are things in the outback that have nothing to do with heat stroke or getting lost. They'll point to specific kilometer markers on their maps and say simply, "Don't stop there, no matter what you see, no matter what you think you hear. Just keep driving." What they won't tell you, at least not unless you've earned their trust, is what they've seen with their own eyes. The figure standing perfectly still beside the road at 3 in the morning, identical to a person except for the way its head rotates a full circle to watch them pass. The lights that pace their trucks for miles, moving in ways that defy physics. The thing that looks human from a distance, but reveals itself as something fundamentally wrong when approached. These aren't stories passed down through generations. These are fresh accounts happening now, to ordinary people driving ordinary routes. Long before Europeans ever set foot on Australian soil, the Aboriginal peoples knew the interior of the continent harbored things beyond human understanding. For over 60,000 years, they developed complex systems of knowledge about which areas to avoid, which paths were safe to travel, and what rituals must be performed before entering certain territories. When British colonists arrived in the late 1700s and began pushing inland, the indigenous people tried to warn them. They spoke of the bunyip, a massive predator lurking in waterholes, powerful enough to drag a full-grown horse beneath the surface. They described the yowie, a towering creature standing 12 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with a smell so putrid it could be detected from hundreds of yards away. Most disturbing was the Yarum Yahoo, a red-skinned humanoid with bulging eyes and suckers covering its hands and feet, said to hunt humans specifically for their blood. The colonists laughed at these warnings. They called them primitive fairy tales, the superstitions of an unsophisticated people. Then the disappearances started. Then the encounters began, and the laughter died in their throats. A sheep farmer in 1873 reported finding half his flock drained of blood overnight, each animal bearing identical circular wounds on their necks. A surveying team in 1902 abandoned their expedition after 3 consecutive nights of something circling their camp, something that walked on 2 legs and stood taller than any man, leaving footprints over 17 inches long, pressed deep into the hard-packed earth. A postal carrier in 1927 quit his route after encountering what he described as 2 identical men standing motionless in the middle of the road at dawn, wearing clothes from a previous century, who vanished the instant he blinked. These historical accounts were easy to dismiss individually, written off as hoaxes or misidentifications. But they kept accumulating, building into an undeniable pattern. Something was happening in the outback, something consistent enough to suggest a genuine phenomenon rather than isolated incidents of confusion or fraud. What makes the Australian interior uniquely disturbing is the sheer diversity of encounters reported there. Most paranormal hotspots around the world specialize. The Pacific Northwest has Bigfoot. Certain areas of Scotland have lake monsters. Specific regions in South America are known for UFO activity. But the Outback has everything. Crypto creatures that match no known species. Ghostly apparitions that interact with the living. Beings that appear extraterrestrial in origin. Phenomena that seem to warp time itself. Entities that defy classification entirely. Things so strange that witnesses struggle to even describe what they've seen. In 1998, a long-haul trucker named Malcolm disappeared for 48 hours on a route he'd driven hundreds of times before. When he finally arrived at his destination, confused and disoriented, he had no memory of the missing time. His truck's odometer showed he'd traveled the correct distance. His fuel consumption matched the trip length, but 2 full days had somehow vanished from his life. Under hypnosis, he described stopping to help what appeared to be a broken-down motorist, only to find the person's face was smooth and featureless, like an unfinished mannequin. That's where his memory ended and the lost time began. In 2004, a family of tourists captured footage on their camcorder that they swear shows a figure moving through the scrub brush alongside the highway they were traveling. When they reviewed the tape later, the figure appears to be keeping pace with their vehicle despite them traveling at over 100 kilometers per hour. Worse, when they zoom in, the figure seems to notice the camera and turns toward it, revealing a face that the family members refuse to describe even now, nearly 20 years later. They destroyed the original tape, but not before making a copy that circulated briefly online before being taken down. Those who claim to have seen it report similar reactions: a deep, instinctive revulsion, followed by nightmares that persist for weeks. The Aboriginal elders have their own understanding of what's happening. They speak of the Dreamtime, a spiritual realm that exists parallel to our physical world, a place where the laws of reality work differently. They explain that certain locations in the Outback are thin places, where the boundary between the Dreamtime and our world becomes permeable. In these areas, things can cross over. Spirits can manifest physically. Time can become fluid. The past, present, and future can overlap and intersect in ways that shatter normal causality. Modern scientists dismiss such explanations as mythology, yet they have no better answers for what's being reported. Geologists point out that some of the areas with the highest concentration of strange encounters sit above unusual magnetic anomalies or have rock formations with high quartz content, but they can't explain how that would produce the effects witnesses describe. Psychologists suggest mass hysteria or cultural contamination of reports, but that doesn't account for historical incidents that occurred before modern communication made sharing stories possible. What everyone agrees on, from Aboriginal elders to veteran truck drivers to researchers who've spent years investigating these phenomena, is that something genuine is happening in the Outback. The encounters are too numerous, too consistent in their strangeness, too similar across time periods and witness backgrounds to be entirely explained by lies or mistakes. People are seeing something real out there in the Red Desert, something that challenges our fundamental understanding of what's possible. The question isn't whether these things are happening. The question is what they are, and why the Australian interior seems to attract or generate them in such variety and frequency. Perhaps the Outback's extreme isolation creates conditions where reality itself becomes unstable. Perhaps the ancient landscape, largely unchanged for millions of years, remembers things that newer lands have forgotten. Or perhaps the Aboriginal people were right all along, and we're simply too stubborn to accept that our scientific worldview doesn't encompass everything that exists. What follows are 3 accounts from people who ventured onto the cursed roads of the Outback and encountered something that defied explanation. These aren't ancient legends or third-hand stories. These are recent, first-hand testimonies from credible witnesses whose lives were fundamentally altered by what they experienced. Their stories will make you question what you think you know about reality, and they might make you think twice before traveling Australia's most isolated highways after the sun goes down. Taryn had been a traffic officer for 23 years when his world shattered on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late 1997. He'd seen fatal crashes, high-speed chases, and violent disputes at traffic stops. Nothing in over 2 decades of police work prepared him for what happened on that remote stretch of South Australian highway, something so profoundly disturbing that he took early retirement within 6 months and refuses to drive through the Outback to this day. It was just past 6 p.m. when he pulled off the road to clean his visor, a routine task he performed several times per shift due to the constant desert dust. He'd killed the engine and removed his helmet when he heard it. A deep, sustained roar of an engine being pushed to its absolute limit. The sound was wrong somehow, too constant, like someone had their accelerator pinned to the floor and was holding it there without variation. Taryn scanned the highway in both directions. Empty. The road stretched to the horizon without a single vehicle in sight. Yet the engine sound grew louder, coming from somewhere close. He turned slowly, trying to pinpoint the source, and saw it. A massive dust cloud rising from the desert about 200 meters off the road, beyond a small rocky rise. His training kicked in. Someone might be in trouble. He walked toward the dust cloud, climbing the incline that separated the highway from whatever was happening beyond it. What he saw when he crested that rise violated every law of physics he understood. A pristine black 1953 Chevrolet Bel Air was driving in perfect circles at high speed on the flat desert floor. The car looked showroom new, its chrome gleaming, not a speck of dust on its paint, despite tearing through the dirt at what Taryn estimated was 80 kilometers per hour. The circles it traced were mathematically precise, leaving deep tire tracks in the hard earth. This had to be an emergency. Maybe the driver had suffered a heart attack, slumped over the wheel with his foot jammed on the accelerator. Taryn began waving his arms and shouting. The Chevrolet completed another perfect circle, and he got his first clear look through the windows. 2 people inside, one driving and one passenger. Neither appeared distressed. Neither seemed to notice him. Something about them struck him as profoundly wrong, though he couldn't identify what. He kept shouting, but the car continued its relentless circling. Then, without warning, it broke pattern and came screaming directly toward him. Taryn froze. The Chevrolet ate up the distance in seconds, and just when impact seemed inevitable, it stopped. Not a gradual braking, not a skid. One moment hurtling forward at tremendous speed, the next completely motionless, as if someone had paused reality itself. The engine continued its sustained high-pitched rev, never varying in tone or intensity. From this distance, he could see them clearly, and his blood turned to ice. Both occupants were men, and they were absolutely identical. Same shoulder-length dark hair, parted in exactly the same place. Same thick black sunglasses. Same disheveled white shirts tucked into mud-stained jeans held up by leather belts. But it was more than matching clothes. The mud stains formed identical patterns on both pairs of jeans. The tears and wrinkles in their shirts corresponded down to the smallest detail. Even their posture matched perfectly, both with left hands on their knees, right hands hanging at their sides, heads tilted at precisely the same angle. Like a photograph and its perfect mirror image. A wave of primal revulsion washed over Taryn, bypassing rational thought and hitting the survival centers of his brain. Every instinct screamed run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He stood paralyzed as simultaneously both car doors opened in perfect unison, moving at exactly the same speed, stopping at exactly the same angle. The 2 men stepped out together, their movements so perfectly synchronized it looked like a rehearsed performance. Left foot, then right, hands gripping door frames in identical positions, bodies rising at the same instant. They were average height and build, nothing physically imposing, but something in the way they moved made Taryn's skin crawl. They stood motionless beside the car, facing him but not acknowledging his presence. Then, moving as one organism, they began to walk, not toward him but past him, heading toward the highway. Their synchronization was inhuman. Steps of identical length at identical intervals, arms swinging in perfect mirror movements. Even their hair moved in the breeze at exactly the same moment in exactly the same way. As they walked past, close enough to touch, they began to separate, flanking him on both sides about 3 meters apart. Taryn finally found his voice. "Hey, stop right there." No reaction. They continued walking, silent and synchronized, heading steadily toward the rocky rise. Professional duty overrode fear. These men had been driving recklessly and were ignoring a direct police command. Taryn started after them, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. I said, "Stop. I need to speak with you." That's when it happened. The thing that would haunt every nightmare for the rest of his life. The two men began to turn their heads, not their bodies, just their heads. And they kept turning. 45 degrees, 90 degrees, looking directly to their sides while walking forward. 135 degrees, faces looking backward while bodies moved ahead. But they didn't stop there. 180 degrees, faces now looking directly behind them while they walked forward. Taryn could see himself reflected in those black sunglasses from this impossible angle. The rotation continued. 225 degrees, 270, 315, and finally, a complete 360-degree rotation, heads facing forward again as if nothing abnormal had occurred. Throughout this entire impossible movement, they remained perfectly synchronized, heads rotating at exactly the same speed, reaching exactly the same angles at exactly the same moments. No sound of cracking vertebrae, no strain or discomfort. Their heads simply rotated smoothly and completely, defying every law of human anatomy. Taryn's legs gave out. He stumbled backward, finally drawing his weapon, though he had no idea what he could possibly do with it. His mind screamed that what he'd just witnessed was impossible, that human necks don't work that way, that this couldn't be real. The two men continued walking in perfect unison, climbing the rocky slope without acknowledging him. Every instinct told Taryn to run, but years of training forced him forward. Weapon drawn, hands shaking violently, he followed them up the incline. He crested the rise seconds after they did. They were gone. The highway stretched empty in both directions. No figures walking away. No footprints in the dust. Nothing. Taryn spun in a complete circle, scanning the landscape. There was nowhere to hide, no cover for hundreds of meters. Two men couldn't simply vanish in seconds. He turned to look back at the Chevrolet. The flat desert floor was empty. No car, no tire tracks, no settling dust, nothing but undisturbed desert, looking like no vehicle had been there in years. Taryn's stomach revolted. He barely made it 2 steps before collapsing to his knees and vomiting violently. The physical reaction broke whatever shock had been holding him together. He vomited again, then sat back, his whole body shaking, covered in cold sweat despite the heat. He doesn't remember walking back to his motorcycle. His next clear memory is kneeling beside it, the sun now low on the horizon. He checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. He'd left to investigate around 6. Nearly 3 hours had passed, but it felt like minutes. Taryn rode directly to the nearest town, breaking every speed limit, When he arrived, his entire unit was looking for him. He'd missed multiple radio checks, hadn't responded to calls, had vanished for hours. His sergeant took one look at his face and immediately called for medical evaluation. Taryn told them he'd felt ill and pulled over to rest, losing track of time. He didn't mention the Chevrolet. He didn't mention the identical men. He didn't mention the impossible neck rotation. Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself. In the weeks that followed, Taryn became obsessed. He scoured police databases for any mention of a black '53 Chevrolet. He searched for reports of identical twins in the area. He requested every incident report from that highway for the past decade. Nothing. No missing persons that matched. No stolen vehicles. No prior encounters. He expanded his search to newspaper archives, then the early internet. He found nothing matching his experience, but he found something else. Other encounters from the Outback that made no sense. Lights that moved in impossible ways. Figures that appeared and vanished. Time distortions. Reality glitches. The experience destroyed his career. Within 6 months, he took early retirement. He moved to the coast, as far from the Outback as possible. He never drove through the interior again. Even seeing red desert on television triggered panic attacks. Years later, when paranormal forums became common, Taryn finally shared his story anonymously. Most responses were skeptical or mocking, but a few stood out. Other people claiming similar encounters. Identical figures moving in perfect synchronization. Entities that looked human, but moved wrong. Things that appeared and disappeared on remote roads. One response chilled him to his core. Another officer from Western Australia described encountering the duplicates 3 years before Taryn's experience. 2 identical women in a red sedan, wearing identical dresses, performing identical movements. When he'd approached to offer assistance, both women smiled with mouths that opened far too wide, revealing nothing but darkness inside. He'd fled to his patrol car and radioed for backup. By the time assistance arrived, the women and their car had vanished. Were these the same entities in different forms? Were there multiple sets of these impossible twins? Or was something in the desert creating these duplicates, copying and corrupting humans into synchronized shells? The response that disturbed him most came from a truck driver who claimed to have seen the black Chevrolet in 2003, 6 years after Taryn's encounter. Same car, same location, same perfect circles in the desert. But when this driver approached, the 2 identical men had simply stared at him through the windows, their heads slowly rotating in unison without their bodies moving, like turrets tracking a target. The driver had run back to his truck and driven away without stopping for 200 kilometers. The same entities, still there, still performing their incomprehensible ritual in the desert, still waiting. Taryn never found definitive answers. What he knows with absolute certainty is that on that Tuesday afternoon in 1997, he encountered something that violated the fundamental laws of reality. Whether they were extraterrestrial beings attempting to mimic humans, interdimensional entities that couldn't quite get human form right, or something else entirely beyond comprehension, he'll never know. What he does know is that they were real. The memory remains vivid 25 years later. Those heads rotating in perfect unison, completing full revolutions while their bodies walked forward. The complete silence except for that endlessly revving engine. The way they moved as one organism despite being 2 separate bodies. And somewhere in the Australian Outback, on that same stretch of highway, those things might still be out there. Still driving their impossible circles. Still walking in perfect synchronization. Still rotating their heads in ways that defy human anatomy. Waiting for the next person curious or unlucky enough to investigate that black Chevrolet and the 2 identical men who should not exist. In late December 2005, University student David needed a ride home to his family's property in rural New South Wales. His friend Marcus offered to drive, a journey requiring over 600 kilometers through some of the most isolated stretches of the Outback. They should have left early morning, arriving before sunset, but a mechanical issue delayed their departure until nearly 4 p.m. Marcus suggested waiting until morning, but David was eager to get home after 4 months away. Besides, the A79 was a major highway, well-maintained with regular traffic even at night. What could possibly go wrong? They set off as twilight fell, the sky turning from purple to black as they left the coast behind. For the first few hours, everything was fine. They talked about classes, summer plans, girls they were interested in. But as the night deepened and kilometers accumulated, traffic thinned. By 11 p.m., they were on one of the most remote sections of the A79. They hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The conversation had died out, both tired from the long drive. David was checking his watch, calculating how much longer until the turnoff, when Marcus suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a violent halt, the seatbelt cutting into David's chest as momentum threw him forward. His head struck something and he heard a sharp crack. His vision cleared and he was staring at a large spiderweb crack in the windshield directly in front of him. When he touched his forehead, there was no pain, no blood, no injury. The crack was too large to have been caused by his head anyway, radiating from a central impact point, as if something had struck from outside. "Marcus, what the hell?" David turned to his friend and his stomach dropped. Marcus was gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes fixed straight ahead, face drained of color. He looked terrified but wasn't responding, wasn't even blinking. "Marcus, are you okay? What happened?" David shook his friend's shoulder, but Marcus remained frozen, staring through the cracked windshield at something David couldn't see. David unbuckled and stepped out into the cool night air. He walked to the front of the car, looking for whatever they'd hit. The bonnet had a small dent, fresh and bright in the headlights. Something had struck the car, but there was no blood, no fur, no evidence of an animal, no body on the road. He crouched down, checking under the car. Nothing. That's when he heard it. A low rustling sound, like something moving through dry brush. Faint at first, but growing steadily louder. David stood, peering beyond the headlight's cone of light, trying to locate the source. The rustling intensified. David's eyes adjusted enough to see movement in scrub brush about 20 meters ahead and left of the car. Something large was struggling through the undergrowth, trying to reach the road. His first thought was an injured kangaroo trying to make its way back to the highway. He took steps forward, moving beyond the headlights, straining to see. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness and starlight, he made out a shape in the brush. It was tall, far too tall to be a kangaroo. The silhouette stood at least 7 feet high with a powerful, muscular build. It was struggling with the brush, branches snapping, but there was something methodical about its movements, something purposeful. This wasn't an injured animal trying to escape. This was something trying to get to the road, trying to get to them. David froze. The figure was closer now, close enough to make out details despite the darkness. It was humanoid, bipedal, but the proportions were wrong. Torso too long, arms too thick, head too large and oddly shaped. Then the creature stepped into starlight, and David's blood turned to ice. It had no face. Where there should have been eyes, nose, and mouth, there was smooth, featureless surface. The skin appeared greenish in the pale light, with an almost waxy texture. But the complete absence of facial features wasn't the most disturbing part. Where a mouth should have been was a ragged vertical slit, like a wound that had never healed. From this opening came a low, wet moaning that made David's skin crawl. Instead of eyes, there were two deep, hollow voids that seemed to tunnel impossibly far back into the skull. Perfectly circular, perfectly black. Despite having no visible means of sight, David was acutely, sickeningly aware that the creature was staring directly at him. The entity freed itself from the brush with a sound of breaking branches and took one heavy step toward the car. Its legs moved in a strange, jerky manner, like something that had studied human walking but couldn't quite replicate it. Another step. The moaning from that vertical mouth wound grew louder. David's paralysis broke with the sudden blare of the car horn. Marcus was leaning on it, the sound cutting through the night, screaming something lost in the horn's wail. David spun and ran. He'd barely closed the door before Marcus floored the accelerator, tires screaming on asphalt. David twisted to look behind them. The creature stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by their receding taillights. It had taken several more steps toward where the car had been, moving with that jerky, unnatural gait. As David watched, it raised one arm slowly, deliberately, as if waving goodbye or beckoning them to return. What made David's blood freeze was that despite the distance, despite their speed, he could still feel those hollow voids fixed on him, tracking his position with impossible accuracy. The creature had no eyes, but it was definitely watching them leave. Marcus didn't slow down for the next hour. He pushed the car well above safe speeds, hands white-knuckled, breathing rapid and shallow. David didn't ask him to slow down. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those hollow voids, that vertical mouth wound, that greenish, waxy skin. They didn't speak for the entire rest of the journey. When they pulled into David's driveway at nearly 2 a.m., both sat in silence before David quietly retrieved his belongings. Marcus drove away without a word. They wouldn't speak about what happened for over 3 years. The next morning, David examined the car in daylight. The dent was real. The cracked windshield was real. Something had struck the car. But what? Had they hit the creature, or had it deliberately stepped into their path? And if they'd hit it hard enough to dent metal and crack glass, how had it been standing and walking moments later? David spent weeks searching for explanations. He researched every known animal in Australia. Nothing came close. Nothing stood 7 feet tall with humanoid proportions and no face. He looked into Aboriginal legends, finding references to various creatures, but nothing matching his encounter. The Yowie came closest in size and bipedal nature, but Yowie descriptions always included hair and ape-like features. This thing had been hairless with skin that looked almost artificial and completely faceless, except for those voids and that terrible vertical mouth. What disturbed David most was discovering the accident statistics for the A79. In the past decade, 17 fatal single-vehicle crashes on that stretch, all at night, all involving cars that had apparently swerved violently for no reason before leaving the road. Official explanations varied: driver fatigue, animal strikes, mechanical failures. But David wondered how many drivers had seen what he'd seen, had swerved to avoid that faceless thing, and paid with their lives. Marcus eventually agreed to talk in late 2008, over 3 years later. They met at a neutral location, both uncomfortable with the memory. Marcus revealed he'd seen the creature before David got out of the car. It had been standing in front of them when he'd braked. "I didn't hit it," Marcus whispered. "It hit us. It walked up and put its hand on the bonnet. That's what made the dent and cracked the windshield. It was testing us, seeing how we'd react. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Those holes where its eyes should have been, It was like they were pulling at something inside me, trying to drag my soul out. I couldn't move until you got out, and then I could only honk the horn. The experience fundamentally changed Marcus. He stopped driving at night entirely. He switched his major from environmental science to accounting to avoid fieldwork in remote areas. He developed severe anxiety requiring medication. The memory of those hollow voids still triggered panic attacks. David became obsessed with documenting strange encounters on Australian highways. His research revealed a disturbing pattern. The A79 had unusually high numbers of unexplained encounters. The faceless creature was always reported in roughly the same 50-kilometer section. One detail from multiple independent accounts particularly disturbed him. Several people reported vivid nightmares for weeks or months after encountering the faceless creature. In these dreams, they were back on the highway, but their car wouldn't start, and the creature would slowly approach, that vertical mouth opening wider and wider, those hollow voids growing larger until they filled the entire field of vision. David had those exact nightmares for 6 months. Marcus still has them occasionally, nearly 2 decades later. The question haunts both of them. What was it? Too large and anatomically unusual to be any known animal. The complete absence of facial features except for voids and vertical mouth suggested something that had evolved or been designed without conventional sensory organs. The greenish, waxy skin didn't look biological, yet it moved, breathed, made sounds. Was it extraterrestrial, interdimensional, an unknown cryptid species, or something so outside our frame of reference we lack concepts to categorize it? Neither found answers. What they know is that on that December night in 2005, they encountered something that should not exist, something that violated every assumption about what's possible. The creature was real. The encounter was real. And somewhere on the A79, it might still be there, standing beside the road in darkness, waiting with its hollow voids and terrible vertical mouth for the next vehicle to pass by. The faceless thing on Highway A79 remains unexplained. One more mystery in the vast collection of high strangeness that concentrates in the Australian Outback. One more reason why those who know the interior best warn others never to stop on certain stretches of road after the sun goes down. Kyle Weston had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years when he broke the one unwritten rule every Outback driver knows: never investigate strange lights in the desert. What happened in the Northern Territory in July 2008 would teach him why that rule exists, and the lesson came at a price he's still paying today. Unlike most drivers who shared tales of the unexplained, Kyle had always been a skeptic. He'd heard the stories at truck stops, the warnings about certain stretches of highway, the accounts of impossible encounters. He'd listened politely and dismissed them as the products of fatigue, isolation, and overactive imaginations. In 15 years of driving Australia's most remote roads, he'd never seen anything that couldn't be explained rationally. That confidence made him careless. It was a Tuesday night, deep in the dry season. Kyle was hauling fertilizer from Alice Springs to Darwin, a journey of nearly 1,500 kilometers through the heart of the continent. He'd passed through Tennant Creek around 9 p.m., and by 11 he was well into the empty stretch where the next real civilization was, over 500 kilometers away. The highway cut straight through flat scrubland, no other vehicles in sight, just endless stars overhead, and the hypnotic rhythm of white lines disappearing into his headlights. Kyle had driven this route dozens of times. He knew every curve, every landmark, every kilometer marker. That's why the red glow immediately caught his attention. It appeared off to the left, maybe 3 kilometers from the highway. At first, Kyle thought it might be a campfire, but the color was wrong. Too deep, too rich, like molten copper rather than burning wood. It pulsed with a steady rhythm, brightening and dimming every few seconds with mechanical precision. The professional part of Kyle's brain suggested a distress signal, someone broken down, using a flare or emergency light. He slowed his truck, watching the glow. It pulsed again, that same deliberate rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Kyle pulled onto the shoulder. He'd helped stranded motorists before. It was part of the unspoken code among Outback drivers. You stopped. You helped. Because one day you might be the one needing assistance in the middle of nowhere. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped into the cool night air. His breath misted as he oriented himself toward the red glow, still pulsing with that metronomic regularity. 3 kilometers wasn't far, 40 minutes round trip at most. The scrubland was denser than it looked from the highway. Kyle picked his way carefully between bushes and around rocks, his flashlight beam dancing ahead. After about 10 minutes, he noticed something strange. The vegetation was getting thicker, forming what looked like natural corridors that seemed to guide him in a specific direction, toward the light. Kyle slowed, unease creeping up his spine. The corridors were too perfect, too deliberate. Bushes and small trees formed walls on either side, leaving clear pathways just wide enough for a person to walk through. It felt intentional, designed. The red glow was very close now, maybe 50 meters ahead. Kyle could see it through gaps in the vegetation, pulsing brighter than before. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Then it stopped pulsing. The glow became constant, intensifying with each second. The scrub around Kyle began to cast red shadows that writhed and twisted in the strengthening light. The temperature rose noticeably, the cool desert night suddenly feeling warm against his skin. That's when the light moved. Not drifting slowly, but rushing toward him with shocking speed. Kyle barely had time to raise his arm before the red glow engulfed him, surrounding him completely. He couldn't see anything beyond the crimson radiance, couldn't orient himself, couldn't tell which direction led back to the highway. The light was hot now, uncomfortably so, like standing too close to an open furnace. Kyle stumbled backward, tripped over something, and fell hard onto the rocky ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, its beam swallowed by the overwhelming red glow. As he lay there, struggling to breathe in the heated air, the light began to coalesce, to take shape. The formless glow contracted and solidified into a human silhouette standing directly over him, no more than 2 meters away. It was the outline of a person, but made entirely of that deep red light. Kyle could see no features, no clothes, no details, just a human-shaped void of brightness that hurt to look at directly. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The torso was slightly too long. The arms hung a bit too low. The head tilted at an angle no human neck could comfortably maintain. The entity stood perfectly still, and despite having no visible eyes, Kyle could feel it studying him, examining him, taking his measure. He tried to scramble backward, but his arms wouldn't support his weight properly. The heat radiating from the figure was intense enough now that he could feel his exposed skin beginning to burn. Not enough to blister. Not yet. But getting dangerously close. The entity moved. One step closer, the movement perfectly fluid despite being made of light. Then another step. It was close enough now that Kyle could have reached out and touched it, though every instinct screamed at him not to. The figure raised both arms, spreading them wide in a gesture that might have been welcoming or might have been threatening. The light intensified further, and Kyle had to squeeze his eyes shut against the brightness and heat. He could see the glow through his closed eyelids, could feel the heat starting to singe his hair. "Stop!" Kyle screamed the word, his voice cracking with terror. "Get away from me." The heat vanished instantly. Not gradually cooling, but gone in a heartbeat, as if someone had flipped a switch. Kyle cautiously opened his eyes. The entity had lowered its arms and taken a step backward. It stood motionless, that featureless head tilted in what looked like curiosity or confusion. It had responded to his command. The realization sent a chill through Kyle that had nothing to do with the suddenly cool night air. This thing was intelligent. It understood him. And that somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than if it had been a mindless force of nature. They remained like that for several seconds, Kyle on the ground, the entity standing over him, neither moving. Then, with terrible deliberation, the figure pointed at him, not threatening, not aggressive, but accusatory. The gesture held weight, judgment, condemnation for some transgression Kyle didn't understand. The pointing finger began to glow brighter, the light concentrating in that single digit aimed at Kyle's chest. The air around the finger started to shimmer and distort, heat radiating from it in visible waves. Kyle could feel his shirt beginning to smolder where the concentrated light touched it. "I'm sorry." The words burst from Kyle without conscious thought. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." The entity's hand snapped closed into a fist. The gesture was sharp, violent, completely at odds with the fluid grace of its previous movements. The light dimmed slightly and the burning sensation on Kyle's chest ceased. For a long moment, nothing happened. The entity stood with its fist clenched, head tilted as if considering Kyle's apology, judging whether it was sufficient, whether he deserved mercy or punishment. Then it turned and walked away, not floating, but walking with perfectly human gait, each footstep deliberate and measured. It moved toward a large eucalyptus tree about 5 meters away, its red glow illuminating the pale bark. Kyle watched, unable to look away, as the figure reached the tree and kept walking. It passed into the trunk, the solid wood offering no resistance. For a brief moment, Kyle could see the entity's silhouette through the tree itself, the wood becoming translucent, revealing the glowing form moving through it like a ghost through a wall. Then it was gone. The glow extinguished, leaving Kyle in absolute darkness, broken only by his fallen flashlight's beam pointing uselessly into the scrub. But the darkness lasted only a second. The red glow erupted from the ground 5 meters to Kyle's left, bursting upward like a geyser of light. The entity rose from the earth itself, pulling itself up as if climbing from a pool, liquid light dripping from its form and dissipating in the air. It stood fully upright, turned its head slowly toward Kyle, and raised its arm to point at him again. This time, the gesture was unmistakably threatening. Kyle didn't wait to see what would happen next. He scrambled to his feet and ran, abandoning his flashlight, abandoning any sense of direction, just running blindly through the scrub. Branches tore at his clothes and face. Rocks turned under his feet. He fell twice, got up both times without breaking stride, kept running. Behind him, the red glow intensified. Kyle could see his shadow stretching out ahead of him, cast by the light pursuing him. He didn't dare look back. He just ran, lungs burning, heart hammering, waiting for the heat to engulf him again. Then he burst onto the highway. The sudden transition from dense scrub to open road almost made him fall again. But he caught himself and sprinted toward his truck, still sitting exactly where he'd left it. Lights on, engine idling. Kyle hauled himself into the cab, slammed the door, hit the lock button. Only then did he risk looking back toward the scrubland. The red glow was there, just at the edge of the vegetation, maybe 20 meters from the highway. The entity stood motionless, watching. As Kyle stared, it raised both arms again, spreading them wide in that same ambiguous gesture. welcoming or threatening, beckoning or warning. Kyle didn't wait to find out which. He threw the truck into gear and accelerated, tires screaming on the asphalt. He pushed the vehicle harder than he ever had, watching his mirrors obsessively, expecting to see that red glow pursuing him. It didn't follow. The last he saw of it was a distant crimson point in his mirrors, standing at the roadside, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. Kyle drove straight through to Darwin, nearly 600 kilometers, without stopping once. He arrived as dawn was breaking, pulled into the first truck stop he found, and sat in his cab shaking for an hour before he could trust his legs to support him. He examined himself in the bathroom mirror. His face was scratched from branches, his clothes torn. And there, on his chest, directly over his heart, was a burn mark, perfectly circular, about the size of a coin, red and blistered, in the exact spot where the entity had pointed at him. The burn never fully healed. Years later, Kyle still has the scar, a perfectly round mark that occasionally aches on cold nights or when storms are coming. A permanent reminder of the night he broke the rules. In the weeks after the encounter, Kyle tried to rationalize what happened. Hallucination from road hypnosis, heat stroke despite the cold night, some kind of electrical phenomenon he didn't understand. None of the explanations worked. The scar was real. The burn was real. The entity had been real. He found scattered reports of red lights in the Northern Territory going back decades. Aboriginal elders spoke of spirit beings that appeared as fire, ancient entities that predated human occupation of the continent. These beings were guardians, they said, protectors of sacred places that should not be disturbed. One account from 1967 described a survey team that saw red lights near the same area. They investigated and 2 team members vanished for 3 days, found eventually wandering the desert with no memory of the lost time and identical circular burns on their chests. Another report from 2003, 5 years before Kyle's encounter, described a prospector who followed a red glow into the bush. His body was found a week later. The official cause of death was exposure and dehydration, but the coroner noted unusual burn patterns across his torso that couldn't be explained by sun exposure or fire. Dozens of circular marks like he'd been repeatedly touched by something impossibly hot. Kyle still drives the Outback, but he's changed. He never investigates strange lights anymore. He doesn't stop on certain stretches of highway after dark. And he warns other drivers, though most don't listen, just like he didn't listen to the warnings he'd heard for 15 years. What haunts him most isn't the fear he felt or the impossibility of what he witnessed. It's the certainty that the entity was intelligent, that it made a decision about him. When he apologized, it stopped. It chose to let him go rather than harm him further. But others haven't been so lucky. Was he trespassing in sacred ground? Had he violated some boundary he didn't know existed? Or had the entity been testing him, measuring his worth, deciding whether he deserved to live or die? The circular scar on his chest suggests he passed that test, barely. But Kyle knows with absolute certainty that if he ever goes back to that stretch of highway, if he ever investigates another strange light in the Northern Territory, the entity won't be so merciful a second time. The being made of light remains one more unexplained phenomenon in a region full of them. But unlike cryptids or ghosts, this entity demonstrated clear intelligence, clear judgment, and clear power. It communicated through gestures, responded to words, and chose to spare or harm based on criteria humans don't understand. Kyle Weston learned that some lights in the desert aren't signals for help. Some are warnings, and some are tests that most people fail.